Hello, investors. Today on Stocks to Watch, we are diving into one of the most talked about themes in technology, humanoid robotics and automation at scale. Robotics is no longer a future concept. It is becoming a core pillar of global productivity, manufacturing, and AI-driven labor solutions. And today I'm joined by Shahab Samimi, CEO of Humanoid Global Holdings Corp, trading on the Canadian Securities Exchange under ROBO, over the counter in the United States as RBOHF, and in Frankfurt as 0xM1. This is a company building a diversified portfolio across the humanoid robotics value chain. You're going to hear all about it. And Saman Farid, CEO of Formic, one of the leaders in robotics as a service with deep real-world deployment experience inside modern factories. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome both of you gentlemen to Stocks to Watch.
Thanks so much for having us, Ashley. Excited to be here.
Likewise.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to hear the story. And I'd like to start with you, Shahab. Humanoid Global, you and I have spoken several times. You've really expanded your portfolio rapidly over the past year. And so I'd ask from your vantage point, what were the most meaningful achievements this year, 2025, and why do they matter to investors watching this space?
Yeah, great question. I think in 2025 we did a number of things. So one, we expanded our full stack portfolio, humanoid portfolio. We then also added our bench strength, I would say, on our advisory side of thing with leaders, including Saman here as well. But we also just recently added the Chief Strategy Officer of Boston Dynamics. So then further to that, we've kind of updated our investment thesis as well going into 2026 and looking at sort of a more operating line of business or a more majority investment opportunity as well that can be a lot more fully kind of vertically aligned with kind of the strategies that we have and the portfolio that we have and the network that we have. So there's been a number of active involvement and evolution and within the company. So we're excited to see what 2026 has to hold for us.
Yeah, I mean, incredible innovations. It seems like every time we have an interview with you, there's always something new coming out of your company. And now I've just learned more new, exciting details. So I'll turn it over to you, Saman. You know, Formic has really been at the center of robotics as a service movement, which I just mentioned in the intro. So what would you say are the shifts in manufacturing demand or labor dynamics that are really pushing companies toward automation right now? Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
Yeah, I think there's really a twofold, dynamic. On the one side, manufacturing businesses are facing a very unique type of new pressure, right? It's actually generally very good news for most factories, especially across kind of North America, Europe, and some of these kind of more established economies where factories that traditionally had really staggered or suffered because of global competition now are seeing renewed interest in rebuilding domestic resilience and domestic supply chains in each of these regions. So, America is kind of one of the ones that's been most vocal about it, but this is a phenomenon that's happening globally. And I think really it was kickstarted by COVID when people realized that all of the products that they really depend on a daily basis are scattered throughout the globe. On the one hand, it's a wonderful miracle of kind of human civilization that we've been able to do that. On the other hand, it creates a lot of points of failure. And so a lot of economies are thinking about ways to build more independence and resilience in their manufacturing base. So that's the one thing, and so in America, we see it, in Canada, we see it, in South America, in Europe, we see factories figuring out, trying to take on more orders, but consistently being capped out on their capacity to deliver. Many of these factories are behind schedule on their production. They have demand to take on more business, but because they have a lack of labor, they're really struggling to do it. We also face this global demographic crisis where, a lot of the people who are working in these factories are now aging out. I think 10,000 people per day in America are retiring out of manufacturing without being backfilled. There's almost a 2 million person gap in just America right now for unfilled manufacturing labor. And so these factories are struggling to grow. And then on the other hand, there's nothing really that's coming into backfill, right? They want to produce a lot more and they can't find the people. On the other side, and I think the trend that Shahab has identified is the capacity of robots is really increasing drastically today. Right? Over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, The hardware of robotics has dropped in price significantly. The capabilities of robots have increased very, very significantly. Robot intelligence, computer vision, vision language action models, all of these things are enabling robots to do things that they couldn't do before. I drive around now in my Tesla self-driving car. I sit in it, I type in the address, and it just takes me to where I want to go. I don't have to touch the steering wheel. So the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And what we see at Formic, and I think more generally in robotics, is that the number of places that need robots is so huge, and the number of places that have robots is so minuscule that something is wrong, right?
Right.
And so I think Shahab and I are kind of sharing this mission of like trying to figure out how we can bridge that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just with your two brains together, the potential for scalability is just, amazing. And this is all fascinating to me. Shahab and I had a really awesome webinar where we talked together, with other companies around AI and robotics, and obviously others in different industries. And, I learned so much, and it's really fascinating, the work that you do, and I really admire it. So thank you for that. Thank you for that perspective. And Shahab, I'll ask you, your portfolio includes companies like Agility Robotics, Cartwheel, Ride Scan, we've talked about this, and others across the humanoid value chain. So when you're evaluating opportunities, what really makes a robotics startup truly investable?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we look at. One, there's an actual problem pain point that's being solved. Second is some sort of a pathway to, industrialization or commercialization. And third, a bit of an advantage in the data or the know-how. And so with that first problem, companies like Agility, Formic, RideScan, they're not just building robots, but they're or searching for a use case. They're attacking a very specific pain point, whether it's in logistics, manufacturing, or safety. And I think second to that industrialization aspect of it, where especially Formic is definitely that industrialization 4.0 sort of aspect of it, right? So we care about that manufacturability of it, the supply chain, safety certification from day one. And then third is kind of that defensibility. What's the data loops look like? What is the IP that's being built? Is there an understanding of the workflows and how is that ingrained and integrated into kind of human tasks and human workflows ultimately, or augmenting them. So those are kind of the key high level things that we look at.
Yeah, solutions. It's just finding solutions. And Saman, this leads me right into my next question to you, where you're evaluating robotics companies not just as an investor, but as an operator deploying machines into these live environments you're talking about. So, what signals would you say tell you that a humanoid or automation startup has long-term potential to solve these problems we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of factors. I run Formic now, where we have robots deployed in more than 100 factories. Prior to that, I was an investor for more than 10 years, where I was investing in a lot of robotics companies and sat on the boards of many of them. And similar to what Shahab is describing, you really separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to robotics companies by looking at how closely they know their customer, right? To how well can they really integrate into a real world workflow, or are they just doing cool demos, right? The lot of cool, like the world is littered with the corpses of robotics companies that just do cool demos. They're in a lab environment, and as soon as they encounter the real world, they fall over. And a lot of these YouTube videos that you see of robots doing backflips, they're awesome, but what they don't show you is the other 99% of the video that they cut out where the robot was falling on its face. And so what's really, really important when it comes to robotics, particularly if you're trying to make a business and not do demos, is the robots have to be robust and resilient to real world environmental situations.
Mhm.
I'll give a couple examples. One, it's very common in a factory for a robot to be picking things up on a regular basis. So we have robots deployed across hundreds of factories. The number one reason why our robots fail when they're picking up a box, for example, it's got nothing to do with the robot. It's because like the box wasn't taped properly, and the robot tries to pick it up and all the contents fall out, right? So this is like a very common occurrence. And if that's the number one reason why your robot's failing, what that means is you need to then know a lot about why is that, what's happening upstream. Is that box, is there a tapering machine there? Is there a person? How can you observe it? How can you monitor for that situation and account for it? so that you can recover quickly when that happens and the robot doesn't get confused and then stop and require human intervention. So, that's on the kind of robot intelligence side. Is it's not just in a vacuum. You can't just design one generalist model and say this is going to solve all my problems. You really need case by case, independent knowledge. On the other side, another example that I'll share is when it comes to robot performance and reliability in the real world, robot maintenance is a really, really important and very under-discussed and painful and unsexy topic, right? These joints on these robots will fail from time to time. The sensors will get covered with dust from time to time. All kinds of little things are really ultimately what differentiate between a robot that works and a robot that doesn't. And I think companies that think through the operational aspects of a robot are very rare and unique. There are a lot of robotics companies out there, again, that they do a couple demos, they go to a couple of facilities and fold some laundry, and then, voila, right? Like that's going to solve all our problems. In reality, it's all those little challenges that are the difference between something that you'll pay for as a customer and something that's just a nice, expensive paperweight. And so when it comes to, robotics companies and looking at robotics founding teams, that's the number one thing that I look for is have they really thought about battle testing this in the real world, and all the aspects that come out of that.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. And I don't think people think about the whole maintenance factor. It's like if you put in a new garage door, there are sensors, there are springs, you have to oil them, you have to maintain it. It's all about the maintenance. And so getting your mind around that is so important. So I appreciate your examples there. And, earlier I talked about you putting your two heads together and the potential for scalability. So I'll ask you, Shahab, where do you see the earliest real commercial adoption happening?
Yeah, I think, Saman's kind of hit the nail on the head and kind of the focus that Formic has, but really the first durable adoption that we're seeing from not just robotics in general, but also general purpose humanoid robotics is kind of the unglamorous places, and labor intensive sectors. So whether it's warehouses, distribution centers, industrial sites is where we're seeing the primary use case and early adoption. But I think a lot of the catalyst that comes further to broader adoption is going to be that continued cost reduction, safety certifications, and more importantly, proof of a 2 or 3 year payback, ROI ultimately in a specific repeatable workflow setting ultimately.
Yeah, the return on investment, so important. So, Saman, I'll ask you, from an engineering and deployment standpoint, what would you say is the biggest gap today between public perception and operational reality?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ashley. Really, the biggest gap between what happens in a kind of engineering lab environment and the operational aspects of deploying a robot, I think a lot of it come down to what the end user is able to digest, right? Like you can't give a baby a hamburger. And I think it's not too different from that. Like when we're talking about the majority of kind of industrial businesses, SMBs, your corner grocery store, they're not going to be capable to become the world expert in robotics themselves, right? They may be the best in the world at making, whatever product. They may be the best at making chocolate chip cookies, but they're not also going to be the best in the world at owning and operating robots effectively at scale. And I think we saw this when it came to, cloud, right? There was a period of time where if you wanted to have an email address, your only option was to have a rack of servers in your, office somewhere with a bunch of air conditioning around it, an IT guy, and a bunch of, static proof things around it. And it was hundreds of thousands of dollars and super expensive. And as a result, only the biggest companies in the world or the labs or the governments had an email address. All the rest of us, had to wait until there were these managed service providers, right, that came around and they said, hey, look, I'll build a building, I'll put all the servers in there, I'll air condition all of them for you, and you can just provision service, you can use it as you want, right? And that's how the 99% of the world population today uses email and almost every other kind of software, actually. It's basically managed by other people's computers, that somebody else is taking care of it, and we are able to just take the benefit. And I think the same thing is true in robotics today, right? I think there's a lot of cool new innovations in robotics, but there's this gap between what the market is making and what the customers can buy. And like most of these end customers are not going to become robotics experts overnight to be able to really figure out which of these cool things do I adopt and how do I manage it, how do I maintain it, what software do I use, how do I update it. There's 1,000 questions associated with that. And so we believe at Formic is that there will be this kind of emergent class of professional robot owner operators that do a managed service and provide just the outcomes as a service to end customers. And I think really that's what's able to bridge the gap. And the same is true, if you look at the last generation of robotics. Sorry to go a little bit long here, but if you look at industrial robots that are in General Motors and Ford, they work great. They've been in production for 30 years. If you go to like a mom and pop shop down the street from General Motors that does a very similar product, but it's a smaller company, they probably have no robots, right? 90% of robot factories in America today have no robots. And there's really just this massive adoption gap that unless we figure out a way to really make it easy for people to adopt robots, it doesn't matter if it's humanoids, it doesn't matter if it's drones, it doesn't matter if it's self-driving cars, we're not going to see mass adoption until it's easy.
And it's really inevitable, right? I mean, like where we're going, the future is here, as you said. So it's really an opportunity to get smart around all of this, what I'm hearing from you. So let's talk about, looking ahead to 2026 and beyond. And Shahab, I'll start with you. What would you say milestone or breakthrough in robotics do you envision will have the biggest impact on the industry?
Yeah, I think, you know, the biggest milestone isn't going to be the next viral video or robot doing a backflip, really. I think it comes down to a handful of things, but really building out a platform, different kind of value chain and use cases. And I think it just comes down to the cycles of different sectors, industries for this adoption. I think it comes down to commercial viability as well, and looking at cost reduction and how thousands of units can be deployed across logistics, light manufacturing in that respect. So I think what we're trying to do is really give a diversified exposure to investors across the value chain, and kind of what we're looking at is the full value chain of like platforms, data, components, safety, intelligence, and being aggressive on the insights and capital deployment there, and not just spraying capital on the next shiny opportunity. So yeah, for us, it's all the enablers and the ecosystem that we can build within the robotics sector.
Fantastic. And Saman, before I ask you to answer that question, so Shahab says that we won't be seeing robots doing backflips, but will we be seeing a baby eating a hamburger? I love that.
Any day now, any day now.
Go ahead, you can answer too, please.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I'm very excited about. First and foremost is the rapid reduction in the cost of hardware components for robots. A lot of that comes from other supply chains that robots are now actually starting to be able to absorb. So there was a famous line many years ago by this guy, Chris Anderson, who was the editor of Wired. He said a lot of the drones benefited from the peacetime dividends of the smartphone wars, right? So people invested hundreds of billions of dollars into building these smartphone ecosystems. And as a result, they built a whole new class of suppliers that could build sensors and compute and actuators and all these things for the smartphones. And a lot of those were actually the foundation that enabled the drone ecosystem to flourish. They benefited from all those components. And I think we have the benefit here standing in 2026 today, where robotics companies are investing gigantic amounts of money into building this supply chain. And not just robotics companies. Just recently, there were the kind of self-driving car wars, right? When the hundreds of billions of dollars were invested into self-driving cars, LiDARs got cheaper, compute got cheaper, sensors got cheaper, and actuators started to get much better. The AI wars that we see today, where people are investing massive amounts of money into data centers, are driving down the cost of GPUs and edge compute and models and access to data. And there's all these kind of other supply chains that are kind of battling for survival. And in the meantime, those of us in robotics are benefiting from all the things that they're doing. I think the humanoid companies are also doing a similar thing, right? Where there's a lot of investment going into humanoids. This is training an ecosystem of suppliers to make linear actuators, to make new types of LiDAR, to make better power electronics. all of those things are converging, and I think we're seeing the benefits of that. So hardware cost is dropping, intelligence is getting much better. I think that goes a little bit without saying, where these AI models are benefiting from more and more data, simulations are getting better, our ability to gather data from the physical world has been limited historically, but now is starting to get better and better. Where we used to really be, internet data is kind of massive and at scale. We don't really have an equivalent for robot data. And so the companies that are able to build their own data flows and data streams are really going to be able to train much, much better AI models for robots. And Formic is an example. We now have 500,000 hours of robot training data. We do about 2,000 hours a day of new data that we are gathering for these AI models. It's allowing us to train AI models at a scale that was previously unprecedented. And so, these are the two trends, I think, kind of cheaper hardware and more capable hardware and better data that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, so excited myself to follow your journey, both of you. And for our investors and those that are watching and listening to this, Shahab, what would you say really makes Humanoid Global a compelling opportunity as this market matures?
Yeah, I think it's a diversified, risk mitigated portfolio construction, giving, democratized access for those, for a sector or industry that's generally reserved for family offices, high net worth individuals. So yeah, I would love for investors to ride alongside us and participate as we kind of grow here in 2026.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both gentlemen so much. Obviously, robotics, automation, AI-driven labor are no longer optional. They're becoming essential infrastructure for the global economy. So many thanks to Shahab Samimi, CEO of Humanoid Global Holdings, and Saman Farid, CEO of Formic, for joining us today, and for investors watching the evolution of humanoid robotics. This is clearly a space to keep a very close eye on. I'm Ashley Berry, and thank you again so much, gentlemen, for joining us here on Stocks to Watch.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.